everyone, today we're going to start with 3.2, the new government. This is going to be your notebook setup for today. Today's objective is students will be able to explain the compromises created in order for the states to ratify the U.S. Constitution. So for today, we are going to talk about how the Articles failed and that led us to creating a new government, the U.S. Constitution. This is what you're going to need in your notebook on the left-hand side. Again, make sure you give yourself space in between each item so that you can fill it in as you go with the notes. Shays Rebellion was the trigger point. Underneath it, you're going to need Daniel Shays, Washington's response, Road to the Convention. We're going to then move on to the Constitutional Convention, where you're going to work on fix the articles and hard work. Finally, state representation, slavery, and the new government underneath that, dividing power in the Electoral College. Shays Rebellion. Some of you may have watched the video on this right after your last test. Shays Rebellion began with Daniel Shays. He was a farmer and a veteran of the Revolutionary War, and he was worried that he was going to be forced to go to prison over debts because taxes were so high after the Revolutionary War that he couldn't afford to pay his taxes. So he ended up recruiting an army of about 1,200 people. And their job was to close local courthouses and demand lower taxes. So they would protest outside of these courthouses and close them down. And if there was no courthouse, then they couldn't have a trial and they couldn't send anyone to debtor's prison. They were pretty successful with being able to do that all over the Northeast. And Washington took notice to that. And Washington had a famous quote in response to Daniel Shays and Shays Rebellion. And his quote was, "What a triumph for our enemies to find that we are incapable of governing ourselves." So this shows us that Washington was indeed concerned with what was happening and why people were upset, and with Shays Rebellion. And so this helped inspire the Constitutional Convention. Shays Rebellion, in addition to Shays Rebellion, though, others understood that there were problems with trade between the states. Again, remember from your last lesson that states could each had to trade with each other. There was no unified government. It made it very complicated and difficult financially. And so that complication, along with Shays Rebellion, led to an inspiring group to want to have a constitutional convention. So James Madison, who's from Virginia, along with Alexander Hamilton, called a constitutional convention. At the Constitutional Convention, they determined to fix the articles. In May of 1787, delegates from every state, for the exception of Rhode Island, went to Pennsylvania. They worked through the summer and wanted to ensure complete privacy. So they kept the doors and windows closed tightly. So they would not let anyone in. They wouldn't let anybody hear anything. So imagine being in this stateroom. This is a painting, a recreation of it. Being in this room with all the windows closed, all the doors closed in July with all of these men. It was extremely hot. And they still continued to do it. George Washington was unanimously elected the leader of the convention, not surprisingly so, and so he led the convention. Out of the convention came some of the greatest compromises in our government. The first was state representation. If you remember from last lesson, there was a big disagreement between small states and big states and the amount of power that each had. And so there was a compromise that came out. Roger Sherman created the Great Compromise. And what the Great Compromise said is there was going to be two houses of Congress. First house would be the Senate, and that meant that each state had equal representation. So currently in the Senate, each state has 2 members that represent that state. So it's completely equal for every single state. And then the House of Representatives, the representation depends on the size of each state. So this way, larger states have a bigger say than smaller states to ensure that people are being represented properly. The second great compromise that came out of the convention was slavery. The 3/5 compromise. So again, with this idea of representation, how are we going to count slaves? Well, what they determined is that for every 5 slaves will count as 3 people in the population count, and that's going to directly impact how the House of Representatives is calculated. The new government also had to figure out how it was going to distribute its power, and that was another great compromise. They determined they were going to have 3 branches. So they divided the power between the 3 branches. And this concept is called federalism, where you divide power between national and state governments. They also created a checks and balances, which meant that each branch of government can check the power of the other branches. And if you look closely at this graphic, it explains how it does that. And I'm going to go into that in a moment. The first branch was the legislative branch. And the legislative branch is Congress, and they're responsible for making all the laws. The second branch is the executive branch. They are the president and the president's office, and they're the ones that execute or carry out the laws. The third branch is the judicial branch. This is the Supreme Court and the courts of appeal and district courts, and they're the ones that interpret the law. We're going to go back for just a second. All right, some of the checks and balances here. First, Congress approves everybody that the president nominates, and they control the budget. If the president vetoes one of Congress's laws, Congress can override that veto. They can also vote to impeach the president out of office. Between the president and the Supreme Court, the president nominates Supreme Court judges. However, the court declares the president's acts inconstitutional. So if the president determines to do something, the Supreme Court can say, nope, that is not constitutional. You cannot do that. Between the judicial branch and Congress, the Supreme Court can call laws unconstitutional. And between the Congress and the Supreme Court, they confirm the president's nomination. So once the president nominates a judge, they're the ones that confirm it. Congress can impeach judges and remove them from office if they feel like they are doing something that they're not supposed to do. Finally, the president is not actually elected by the people. The president is elected, in fact, by the Electoral College. The Electoral College is determined by adding the number of electors per state is calculated by adding the numbers of representatives of each state and the numbers of senators of each state. Oops, sorry guys. Let me try that again. And when that happens, you get, my apologies. You get the number of electorates. Now, the electorates are the ones that actually cast their vote for president. Historically, the electorates are supposed to vote in the way that the people from their district vote. So, for example, we have an elector that represents Alexandria's region. That elector should vote the way the majority of the people within the city of Alexandria voted. So if the majority of the people vote for the Democratic nominee, then that elector should vote for the Democratic nominee. If we have a Republican, or the majority vote for a Republican nominee, then they should vote for the Republican nominee. That is typically how it's supposed to work. Now, it doesn't have to work that way. The elector can choose to vote differently if they feel that it meets the best needs of the country. We do not see this happen very often, but it is in fact possible. All right, and that is it for today.